Good evening from India. My name is Rajkumar. I'm the founding Vice Chancellor of OP Jindal Global University. Good morning to our friends in North America and Canada. Good afternoon to some others who may be watching this program. We are on the second day of the Global Virtual Conference on Reimagining and Transforming the Future of Law Schools and Legal Education. We are on the 20th thematic session on the theme Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice as the Law School Mission. We have a wonderful group of distinguished leaders, institution builders, transformative individuals who are in their own right contributing to change. We have with us Professor IMELDA MAHER MRIA, the Dean of Law and Sutherland Full Professor of European Law at University College Dublin, Ireland. We have with us Professor Mark Bell, Head School of Law, Trinity College, Dublin, the University of Dublin, Ireland. Professor URFAN KHALIQ, Head School of Law and Politics, Cardiff University, United Kingdom. Professor Dr. GIUSEPPE MASTRUZZO, College Director, International University College of Turin, Italy. We also have with us Professor Dr. Williams C. Him, my own colleague, Associate Professor at Jindal Global Law School of OP Jindal Global University. With those words, I'm going to request Williams to take over this session and continue the proceedings of the session. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Professor Rajkumar, for the introduction. My name is Williams IHEME, as he rightly said, and I teach law here at JGU. It is indeed an honor to be chairing this 20th session of the conference titled Diversity, Inclusion, and Social Justice at the Law School Mission. Before we turn to the distinguished panelists to hear their rich reflections on this subject, I want to briefly say in relation to the theme that as early as 1994, UNESCO's Salamanca statement called for a global movement on inclusive education. The Sustainable Development Goal of 2030 declares to ensure inclusive and equitable opportunities for all. These goals and agendas are based on the much broader idea of social justice, echoed by Nobel laureate Amartya Sen much earlier in the 80s in what he called the capability approach, by which diversity and human heterogeneity are central to defining capability. An inclusive educational setting envisaged by Sen tends to expand and equalize the actual freedom of students from all sections and communities of society. Law schools and universities around the world have since long been operating with a mission to provide equal opportunities in education by committing to diversity. So diversity becomes important as it relates to or translates into a larger representation of all sections of society, which in turn leads to a richer learning environment and a better cognitive development of students. Diversity in higher education leads to equality, which would eventually lead to a society that thrives on the increased availability of skilled and talented human resources. However, the mission to achieve diversity and inclusion and maintaining equality is accomplished by a large set of responsibilities on the part of institutions, such that they cater to students from diverse socio-cultural backgrounds. Now, despite many national as well as international research highlighting increased access to university education, inequality and discrimination prevail in campuses. This is particularly problematic in the case of law schools, as they impact education in law, which is the means to resist all inequalities in society. Law schools that fail to ensure diversity and inclusion will be perpetuating hierarchies, resulting in subtle forms of harassment to major incidents of discrimination, which would be antithetical to its very existence. So it is essential that law schools commit to larger diversity and inclusion as their mission. Pathologically approaching the problem, various officials or officially appointed committees have concluded that caste-based discrimination has been institutionalized in many institutions. Similarly, instances of racial discrimination in many universities around the world have also popped up time and again. These issues have become worse over the last few years with an ever-increasing sentiment of not being heard among the youth in general. So it becomes paramount for law school to become the model for other institutions, prompting them to reimagine their policies and practices and include diversity, inclusion, and social justice as their mission. Institutions must strive to create a more inclusive space for learning such that larger social justice is served. So that is my opening statement. And at this juncture, I would like to hear what the esteemed, distinguished panelists would have to say with respect to this theme that is under reference. So I would like to hear the thought of the panelists, starting with Professor Mark Bell, who is the head School of Law at Trinity College, Dublin. Professor, I'm curious to know what you think with respect to the growing geopolitical unrest among certain sections of the society due to increasing discrimination. Do you think it could affect the aspirations of students from those sections to even aim for university spaces? If that is the case, how could law schools ensure that they maintain diversity within their institutions? Professor.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that it's clear that this has been a period which has placed extreme stress on many different aspects of society, and some groups that were already subject to marginalization in society have seen their position deteriorate. And it seems to me that from the perspective of law schools and universities in general, what many of us have already been involved for some time in efforts to broaden participation, to make universities a more inclusive environment. And there's a danger that we will erode the progress that has already been made, and that some of those groups that are most distant from higher education will find those barriers rising as a result of some of the effects from the pandemic. So I think that this is a time where we have to, in a way, redouble efforts to outreach to underrepresented groups, and also to be very attentive to the needs of diverse students within our current student body, some of whom may be experiencing the current situation more severely than others, and as I'm sure others will wish to talk about, the challenges of learning in a largely remote environment. And in many colleges, most, if not all, teaching has moved remotely, and that the effects of that may not be even across the board.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll come back to you, Professor Bell, but before then, Professor KHALIQ, I would like to know or hear your thoughts with respect to what you think should be the weightage given to the issue of diversity and inclusion. So based on your experiences, what do you think constitute or should be the best practices? And do you think there should be special outreach policies that should innovate, and underline the way policies around, diversity and inclusion in law schools are generated? So towards creating diversity and inclusion and creating social justice, what do you think should be the weightage given to diversity and inclusion in law school policies? Professor KHALIQ?
Thank you very much. That's a very difficult question, actually, because certainly in the UK, one has to bear in mind that the starting point for higher education is that it's a semi-marketized industry. Now, I don't wish to talk about industries when we talk about education, but that is the sort of the prism that we're dealing with. We are dealing with, as a head of school, as I'm sure my other panelists here all know, we deal with targets, we deal with incomes, we deal with league tables and league table positioning. In all of that, we have to ensure that we make budgets, and our income, certainly in my school, 90% is based upon student fees. And fees, of course, are paid for by the students themselves, perhaps through government loans, but they are loans, they are not grants. That's where we start. Now, that by definition is exclusive, because you are looking at the costs to the individuals of accessing higher education. Now, as a university, as a school, we have a very strong commitment to diversity inclusion. But what does diversity mean? Look, if we look at our if we look at our staff, how diverse is our staff? Now, I am very clearly, visibly from South Asia, but for many years, I was the only visible minority in a school. Yet we are saying very clearly that we want to be more diverse, yet we don't have the role models coming through the academy. And equally, it shows that there are very few people who make the transition from being an undergraduate student, getting access to an elite university, and then going on and becoming a member of staff. I have to say, and I'm very pleased to say, that certainly in the last 25 years that I've been an academic, that has changed. We have become more diverse. We are still simply not as diverse as we should be, but that position certainly has changed. If we talk about the inclusivity and diversity of our student body, certainly in what are the leading UK universities and the leading UK law schools within broadly the public sector universities, they are, for want of a better word, elitist. They are the students with the highest grades, who tend to come from, generally speaking, not exclusively, the higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Therefore, reaching out to students who have the ability and the potential, but who come from less privileged backgrounds, is a significant issue. Often there's an overlap between socioeconomic background and race, certainly within the UK context. But we do have a significant number of programs. These are known as widening participation programs to try and work with students. So in my university, we work with a very well-known and regarded charity known as the Sutton Trust. And we try and encourage students to come through the Sutton Trust, what are known as pathways. And these students who come on the Sutton Trust program receive what I might call sponsorship from the Sutton Trust. And we as a university put on a program to help those students transition into university. I think one thing which is perhaps underappreciated, certainly outside of some schools, and certainly mine is a good example, is that students will not even apply to you if they consider you are an elitist institution, because they feel they don't have the social capital and the cultural capital to prosper at your university. So the Sutton Trust program, and it's not only my university, other universities also run that program, helps to break down those barriers. So these are children usually from the lowest socioeconomic classes. Quite often there's an overlap with those students who have promise, who are the children of immigrants, visibly children of immigrants, I would also add. But these are students who are, if I said to you in numbers, in my school at least, we have around 350 to 400 undergraduates coming into the law program per year. Those students who come through widening participation would be around 1 dozen, if that. So you can see the numbers are not particularly great. But there is a real attempt to ensure there is diversity and inclusion. In terms of social justice, it is very interesting that as a school, and again, this is fairly common across the UK sector, there is a very strong emphasis on social justice. In my school, for example, we run a miscarriages of justice unit, so helping those who have suffered sort of basically incidents where they've been found guilty of crimes which they haven't committed. We have a pro bono unit where we work with those who cannot afford legal representation. We also have units such as global justice units where we work, for example, on patents with regard to medicine and the legal issues around intellectual property. So there is a very strong social justice dimension to our work, but we recognize, and it's a real challenge for us, that we need to become more diverse, we need to become more inclusive, both with regard to our staff and the makeup of staff, but also with regard to students and the ability to admit students on the basis of their potential, quite often, not of their achieved grades. And that's where the real institutional obstacles often exist.
Thank you very much, Professor KHALIQ. Now, because the one interesting quality or feature about this panel is that you all lead your various law schools, and that is very interesting and one of the rich additions of this particular session. And Professor MRIA, I was wondering to know what you think with respect to result-oriented policies. Now, in policies or in justice generally, we do say that justice must not just be done, but must be manifestly seen as being done. And what you feel or get from many law schools is that apart from the bare minimum of setting up various committees to address issues of or grievances related to discrimination on the basis of caste, creed, color, sex, and various abilities. What other steps, this time around, result-oriented or practical steps can be taken by institutions towards ensuring inclusiveness so that those students targeted or those students who are targeted by such policies can feel the impact and not just knowing that something like that exists in handbooks?
Okay. Thank you. I'm really delighted to be on this panel today. I think there's 3 levels to the answer to that question. First level is government. It depends what government policy is. Now, I know that's just a policy and it's just written down, but I think in our instance here in Ireland, it has had a big impact. So our universities are expected to have 30% of intake from underrepresented groups. And that target has been taken very seriously in turn by the universities because it affects their funding. So the target of 30% has been taken very seriously by the universities because it affects their funding. And my university worked hard to achieve it. So the law school has managed that. So interesting to hear the experience in Wales. We would have 7 different access routes into our law degrees, and which helps because there's a range of ways that you can get to the school. In terms of implementation, so I think the government is one level, then the university, it's got an EDI unit, it consults around dignity and respect. I think that's also important on a micro level, but I actually think it's been quite transformative in relation to gender. University committees must have 40% of any one gender on the committee. And that's been very empowering and has opened up all sorts of discussions about broader questions around diversity, which has been very helpful. And then at the school level, which is the most important level in terms of answering the question, I'm interested in the comment earlier about how socioeconomic issues overlap very much with questions of race in particular. And in the law school, we've attempted to address that by creating a program. And there's 2 aspects to this. One is where we have received sponsorship from a law firm, Mason Hayes Curran, in order to offer scholarships based on need to bring students into our degree program. So, because finance is a major question. And then we offer bursaries. You cannot, for example, organize a field trip in the school. You cannot organize an internship unless you have a bursary associated with it. We can't fund every student on these trips, but we want the students to know we know everyone can't afford to go. And that we feel even that 1 or 2 scholarships let the students know we still want you here and we're really sorry we can't let everyone go. But that we at least understand that not everyone is in the position to travel. The other aspect that we have is a new government program where we're essentially a pilot called Pathways to the Professions. And this is a 5-year plan where we're starting at the students who are about to go into high school. Our students will be trained up to go out and teach them about law and then bring them into the law school with their parents so that they know from the ages of 12, 13, that we are interested in them and we see them in the future as becoming lawyers and coming into the law school. And then a final element is, thanks to our recent graduates, some of whom I met only last week actually to talk about diversity, they're also taking initiatives and setting up NGOs to assist students, and one of whom has set up a mentoring program where she has arranged a community of recent alumni to go in and talk to mentor individual students in their final year of school. And another scheme, some of the feedback we're getting is, they can get to university, they feel supported in universities, but the real challenge is then moving into the professions.
Thank you, Professor MRIA. Yeah, thank you very much. So now let's take a step further in that discussion. The pandemic came, and both schools, faculty members, and students are experimenting a lot of things at the same time. However, the university teaching and instruction must go on. I do know that many universities have in place apparatuses with respect to taking care of students with mental disabilities. However, all of these have been worsened by the pandemic. And I was wondering whether universities have measured up with, or beefed up their apparatuses in ways that respond adequately to the pandemic. So, Professor MASTRUZZO, what do you think universities should do towards amplifying and towards, creating suitable platforms for taking care of students with mental disabilities, especially as we battle with the global pandemic?
Well, it's a peculiar question. It is addressed to the director of a very small institution. We do have, however, a student with disabilities. We had it in the last year, and we solved the problem our way. We forced the situation. So the first problem we had was how to elaborate on distance, let's say, interaction between teachers and students. The first thing we understood is that a class in presence is not a class online. You can't just have a lecture with the same dynamics that you have it in a class. The second thing we understood was that the student in particular who had further problems to solve had to be, facilitated in a different way, which ignored in a way the emergency. And we did that. We allowed the student to come to the university, which was officially closed. And we had the student in class with another 2 students and the teachers. So we solved it, allowing for, if you want, diversity with a different context that we offered to the student. But let me expand on the difference between being in presence that builds academic community and being online. In a couple of weeks, we realized that students shouldn't be allowed to turn off their videos, for instance. We did have at some point in years past some lectures which were provided for instance, from California, but it was a different kind of online lecture because while the lecturer was somewhere else, the class was all in the same place. This time, to recreate a common space, one has to, look at each other of the group and of the class. So it was very, very important to have the students who looked at you through the medium. This of the face, you see, is an extremely important, I think, problem that COVID has, proposed to us. Because now we are with the mask, I have my mask here. And this is the way I forcibly go around, you know, in Italy at the moment in my red zone. The face, you know, is the place of many, many things. The face is the place of credibility. And when you teach, you do have a problem of credibility to, you know, be authoritative to transmit your message. The face is the place of civic action. The face is the place of politics even, you know. So this erasure, this cancellation, this deletion of the face is something that we should propose as a problem to everybody, and certainly more so in a faculty of law. You know, we should be aware of the fact that, you know, when you teach online, when you interact online, the face is even more important than in class, and then and that you should allow for faces to exchange looks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor MASTRUZZO. I have a follow-up question based on what you have been talking about, but I will address that to Professor KHALIQ and see what the perspective is with respect to students in the UK. So, Professor, from my experience, I know that there are a lot of students who see university education mainly from the brick and mortar experience. And if a typical university semester is about 4 months, and what helps many students to, you know, endure academic instruction up to that length of time at a given semester is usually because they are within other students. So peer groups, you know, help students to actually survive some of the tensions that are created by, you know, the intensity of university education. So if we agree that peer groups of students play a significant role in ensuring inclusion through various campus-based interactions and intermingling, and now the closure of university spaces due to the pandemic has foiled the scope of such regular physical interactions. How can our institutions think more creatively, and what kind of student-level activities may be designed to involve more participation, a kind of gap, having a gap-filling function to the void that has been created already by the pandemic? Professor KHALIQ.
That's a very interesting question, and it's a very live issue for us. Now, because of the way in which the pandemic has been dealt with by higher education institutions in the UK, there have been solutions to the problem you pose, but also further problems created by the problem that you pose or the issue that you raise. So if I can explain this, in the UK, universities have worked on the model of blended learning, and this is providing a lot of material online so students can access it remotely, but equally ensuring that there is teaching face-to-face, as in the traditional model that we had. But because of social distancing, the amount of teaching that students can have on a personal level has been reduced, because your classroom suddenly is no longer able to take your 12 or your 15 students, and you certainly cannot have 200 students in a lecture theatre, because no lecture theatre is big enough to allow them to space. What it does mean is that where you have students who have decided they would like face-to-face teaching, which is a significant number, they then move to traditional university halls of residences. And those halls of residences have then become basically arenas for the transmission of the pandemic. So there have been huge spikes in transmission of the pandemic within university halls of residences. Now, all universities that I'm aware of have permitted students not to undertake face-to-face teaching, but they can, if they choose, be taught entirely remotely. Now, we know, for example, that certainly in my school and across my institution, if you are not in a lab-based discipline, so that will be all law schools, you are effectively allowed to study remotely. So we have a large number of students in India, in Pakistan, in Malaysia, for example, who have followed all of their studies remotely. How you keep those students engaged and committed to their studies while they are many thousands of miles away from their peers who are studying those programs with them, how you teach them at times which are conducive to their time zone, and so forth, are huge challenges. So we, for example, and we've never done this, we have classes at 8 o'clock in the morning being streamed for students who are in a time zone 8 hours ahead. We probably have classes at different times of the day to allow for where we think the majority of students might be. So we will allocate students from, let's say, Malaysia in a class which will take time 4 o'clock their time. So it takes place at 8 o'clock within the UK. Now, how you keep those students engaged is very difficult. So one thing you can try and do is you can try and ensure that they have a weekly meeting with their personal tutor, just to check in with them. We've created Zoom breakout groups where students have a virtual coffee together to ensure they get to know one another. But these are very artificial interactions because you are creating groups for students. These groups are not in any way spontaneous. One thing we've discovered, and we discovered very quickly, is that digital poverty is a significant issue for a lot of students. Access to the bandwidth they need, access to computer equipment or the high quality of cameras that they may wish to have access to. Professor MASTRUZZO's observation about the video always being kept on is a fascinating one, because our policy has been students can turn it off. The reason being that, of course, some students will wish to turn it off for cultural reasons. Some students we know, and this is a significant issue, although we are inclusive and we are diverse, we know that we are teaching some subjects which are very sensitive politically, and students are observing those subjects in parts of the world where we don't wish them to get into trouble, because there are discussions around those sorts of things, and monitoring around access to the internet, the subject material being studied. So if students wish to opt out of classes, we haven't paid attention to that, because we are conscious that there may be broader security issues which may affect them. So engagement has been a very significant issue. We have tried various things. We don't know how they will work. We don't know how successful they have been. And I think I will add that after the Christmas vacation, we may see a drop-off in student enrollments. We may see students not returning. We are predicting that some students will not return. We simply don't know how many. And we'll have an indication then of how successful our engagement activities have been.
Thank you very much, Professor KHALIQ. Professor Maher, the next question relates to, is almost it builds on the previous thesis you are trying to advance, and somehow relates also to Professor KHALIQ's last remark. So I'm wondering to find out what you think, especially now that many schools are interested in fashioning their policies in ways that might be of assistance, especially to students from low backgrounds. So we do not know how the pandemic will continue to pose challenges, and the different types of challenges that might be posed maybe from next year, as Professor KHALIQ was talking about. Several studies have shown that the pandemic has adversely affected women and individuals belonging to lower socioeconomic background. In this context, how do you think the pandemic could affect differently the students belonging to the lower strata? What can be done by institutions to mitigate this effect, especially when all work is done by faculty, staff, and even students remotely these days?
Great question. So you're right, it builds on what Professor KHALIQ's been saying, because I think one really important issue, especially where women have care responsibilities, is flexibility. So a lot of universities, A, they don't require you to attend, and B, everything is recorded. So even though it's not, it may not be fully integrated blended learning in that you're just recording what may be happening in a classroom, that at least the student has an opportunity to listen in and to see the lecture at a more convenient time. I think that in the current climate, that's absolutely crucial. And that goes also for people with poor bandwidth. So, trying to log in at 2 o'clock in the afternoon would be very difficult, but you could do it at 8 o'clock at night when it's a bit quieter. So I think flexibility would be, I think, absolutely crucial. The Irish government stepped in here as well in the last budget and actually gave a substantial chunk of money to the university specifically for students around COVID. And that has been used, for example, to respond to technology poverty, if you like, for students, to buy them equipment so that they can participate more effectively. And the third thing that's happened in Dublin, a lot of our students would be within commuting distance of the universities. I'm sure Mark would echo this as well with his university, that we have kept our buildings open. So we're teaching remotely, but every building is open and the students know this and they can all come in, because technology poverty is one issue, but a big issue we find is space. Students are living in relatively cramped conditions, some of them, and they're not able to have a quiet area where they can do, 4 hours of learning online in a way that they can hear everything. So I think it's actually, I found it a bit puzzling initially when the university said that, the buildings will remain open. I thought, well, why is that? Everything's online. But in fact, the students have been coming in and at a safe distance, everything is organized so they're not too close to each other. Everyone wears masks, but that they can come and sit and work. And that has become, and because our Wi-Fi is very good on campus, and that has been quite an important factor as well. On women, the other comment I would make is that care, like there are men with care responsibilities as well, but the general point around care is significant for faculty as well. And particularly the impact on research since March has been significant.
Thank you very much. Professor Bell, I'm back to you. So there is the saying that why ideas are easy to conceive, they are usually very difficult to deliver. And now my question goes to resources. So in the last 9 months or 8 months, we experienced the pandemic. There have been a lot of discussions and conversations with respect to some of the issues we have been talking about, diversity and the lack of it. So my question is, do you think the discussions and conversations had around this subject usually translate into hiring of teachers and other human resources that could help to drive the policies or could help to enforce or come up with richer policies towards ensuring inclusion and diversity on our campuses? So how can law schools in particular take the lead in ensuring representation and inclusion at all levels of their function? Again, what role will diversity at the leadership level in law schools play in ensuring diversity and inclusion across the institution? So about 2 or 3 questions, tied into one. So what do you think, Professor Bell?
Well, as I think Professor KHALIQ already alluded to earlier, it's very important that there are role models and that there is appropriate representation of people within the teaching and research faculty of law schools. And that's certainly a challenge, particularly when we look at the data on progression and seniority within law schools. Certainly, many Irish and I think also British law schools, we see, for example, good representation of women and men at entry-level lectureships, but we know that as you go up through the hierarchy, that often the representation of women becomes lower, and so we need to look at that pipeline and where people help making sure that people can progress. And I think in the current context that may be more challenging, because we know that universities, many of them are taking very severe financial impacts from the crisis, and that may lead to a contraction in opportunities for promotion, for reward. It's likely to lead to a reduction in the availability of vacancies. And that's something that we can't, sometimes there's a tendency for complacency to sort of look at data on human resources and diversity, and to sort of think, well, with the passage of time, you know, people will just move their way up the chain, and diversity will eventually materialize. But we know that that's not necessarily what happens, and you can have setbacks as well as advances. So, I mean, within my own institution, but I'm sure that's representative of others, you know, the promotion process, I suppose, is a very critical juncture for academic staff, and making sure that there's good quality mentoring and support available, especially for underrepresented groups. You know, when last year, my own law school, we were applying for the Athena Swan Gender Equality Award, and as part of that we surveyed our staff, and one of the main things that came back from that staff survey was that you know, staff had you know, understanding what did you really need to do to get promoted, how did you really advance your career, and concerns about that came through strongly. So I think institutions need to look very closely at how they support staff through the career progression process. And a common issue there, of course, may be a sort of a perception that it's all about research, and again, you know, I think as Professor Maher has mentioned, for those staff with caring responsibilities, for staff who have taken time out in their career, for perhaps relating to caring responsibilities, ensuring that that doesn't disadvantage them in the progression of their career. So one of the things that we have been looking at is trying to provide a reduced workload for those who are returning from, for example, maternity leave, to give them the opportunity to adapt to a new situation, to have more time for research after a career break. So certainly it's an area that demands a lot of attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Bell. My next question appears to be a rhetorical question, but Professor Maher, I'm sorry that I have to come back to you again after you just answered the question for me, but this probably will be my last question to you. So what do you think? Because for centuries, it appears that legal education has been dominated by a particular gender. Correct me if I'm wrong. And earlier we agreed that law could be a sharp tool that helps to pierce through issues of inequalities. And in this case, we do know that in many societies, women are still being marginalized, and people of other backgrounds are also being marginalized. And if we agree that law or legal education is a sharp tool that can help to, you know, pierce through issues of inequalities, can the representation of women in the judiciary, for instance, and in decision-making positions in law firms and corporate bodies be, you know, be an improved way of enhancing instances of diversity, or the level of diversity and inclusion in legal training? So, do you think that or how do you think that law schools can be, you know, can fashion the admission policy so that gender balance is achieved? Should we see admission of law students essentially from the perspective of institutional requirement or social requirement? And depending on how you answer, how do you think the way institutions admit, especially very good institutions admit students in law programs, can help to, you know, stop or address issues of inequalities in society? Professor Maher.
Thank you. Okay, well, first thing, a long time ago, when I was an undergraduate, the gender split was 50-50, male-female. So I think the profession, the legal education has been roughly 50-50 for men and women for a long time. And echoing what Professor Bell said, that, you know, you cannot rely on longevity to change things. And from that, then I would draw 3 points. One is there are very few full professors who are female in the Irish education system. The figure is it was 21% until the government got heavily involved due to a scandal that emerged, or a big story about 6 years ago now. And they've now introduced a system of women-only professorships. And that system, that's designed to facilitate, not just in law, obviously, but across the board. Law is much better than several other disciplines. I mention that because it is very difficult for us to throw stones at the professions if we ourselves are not doing very well on gender, which I unfortunately think is the case. In relation to the professions in Ireland, it's a split profession. So we have a bar, which is the litigation and advocacy work. And then we have law firms. And they are, both branches of the professions are extremely mindful of gender. This has become part of the discourse, if you like, in the last few years in particular. But there are two really big challenges, and I think these would be generally accepted. One is that at the bar, one is self-employed, and it can be extremely challenging where you have family commitments to put in the kind of hours and time. There's no maternity leave, for example, if you're self-employed, whatever profession you're in. And that can be quite a major barrier. It's very difficult to get started generally in at the bar in Ireland in any event, just because it takes time to build up a practice, whether you're male or female. And then in relation to law firms, there is a long hours culture. I think it's true of law firms, certainly in the UK as well. And that mitigates against people who, be they male or female, who wish to have a better work-life balance. I do think law firms are very live to this because work-life balance has become much more important for graduates. But we have yet to see it make a really significant effect on women in senior places.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Maher. Now, we have gotten some questions from the audience, and we have a lot of them, but given that time is of the essence, perhaps we'll be able to address one or two of them. The first one, Professor MASTRUZZO, the first one perhaps relates to what we were discussing earlier, so I'll address it to you. So the first question says, as classes have been conducted online across universities, there is limited interaction between students and their teachers. Some students who are introverts and shy have difficulties matching with the pace of the class. What can be done during these times to bridge the gap of these students and prevent them from lagging behind? Professor MASTRUZZO.
Yes, this is a big problem. Not being in the same class, it's more difficult for people who are not extroverts, let's say, to interact. One of the things that you can easily do is to prepare your classes, allowing for some time to be dedicated to 1, 2, 3 different students, posing some questions before the class so that they develop it and present it orally to the rest of the class. Another thing is to create groups of study so that the presenter of the results in the group will be the student who is the shyest, let's say, in the group. The important, I think, thing, if you can do that, for instance, if you have a situation like the one I have in my college, where students that come from all over the world, 85% of these students are not Italian, are anyway in the territory. The one good thing could be anyway to have moments when you meet physically, even at a distance with all the security measures, because creating a class make it easier than to interact online on a platform. The good luck we had last year was that classes were already formed when we had then to shift online and in platforms. This year is more difficult because classes are not formed. These students haven't interacted. They do not know by their skins, I would say. And this is you know, much of a problem. So there are many things that you can do preparing the classes, not just to deliver a front class, but allowing for the students to participate, even forcing them to participate, and giving a role to the shyer ones. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, I have many more questions, but I'll combine, I think, two questions actually are trying to get the same answer, and is with respect to some of the unique limitations that some students face. So now students are back home in their different places. There are some who face, you know, environmental challenges, for instance, cyclone in India. The southern parts, you frequently, you know, get issues, environmental issues such as cyclone. And there are some students who may have limitations such as a lack of internet, not able to access university online resources. And myself, I've also witnessed instances where you have to extend deadlines for some students because of some of these limitations, unique limitations in their areas. Some students, I believe, are beginning to, you know, find out whether some of these things could be chiseled deeply into university policies to recognize those limitations that some students face uniquely. So, Professor KHALIQ, I was wondering if you have one or two thoughts to share with respect to this.
Yes, I mean those are very interesting issues. Certainly in the UK university sector, there are very well developed policies which are known as extenuating circumstances. And these have been developed over a long period of time where students can submit how their studies have been affected. Now, students do submit the full gamut of life's sort of life incidents. So you have students who've become unwell, family members become unwell, their family suffers disaster, whatever it may be. This has affected their studies. But these are all dealt with by a group. They are all submitted around the time of assessments, and students are then given the opportunity to resit, often without prejudice to the first attempt or the second attempt. So they are basically allowed to sit their examinations again. Certainly a student who had been affected by a cyclone within a UK university would certainly be given extenuating circumstances. The key thing always is how can you evidence it? Can you evidence how you were affected in particular? And if you can evidence that, then that doesn't pose a problem. In terms of not being able to access university materials due to insufficient bandwidth and so forth, I mean, there are some very interesting issues around how you design your blended learning, how you design your online materials to make sure they are accessible for those with lower bandwidth is one issue, and also those who have various visual impairments or hearing impairments, and can you sort of ensure that you are inclusive in the way in which you design your learning materials. We certainly have some material which tells us that we need to avoid certain colors, for example, in your text. You need to avoid certain types of images in your text so that these are accessible to everyone. So there are very developed policies which certainly exist in the UK sector. I'm sure they exist elsewhere as well. And those can assist, and certainly in the context of a pandemic, we've used those policies in a particular way, which has been that no student needed to notify us of their studies being affected by the pandemic. We assumed that was the case, and we made the adjustments necessary.
Thank you, Professor KHALIQ. Professor Bell, some students want it to be prophetic, for instance, to know whether some of the pandemic initiated policies with respect to how academic interactions are conducted nowadays, the fact that we have this conference from all over the world, the fact that these days we have a lot of intercultural and very diverse programs going on among universities across the world. So if we discover vaccine and everyone is vaccinated, for instance, some students want to know, for instance, whether some of the cultural practices already developed, which, for instance, have given birth to some of these conferences and some of these interactions will continue, or when universities go back to how things used to be before the pandemic. What do you think? It requires it to be a little bit prophetic, but I would like to hear what you want to say.
I think that, you know, obviously, as we've been discussing, you know, at the current time, we certainly miss the opportunity for face-to-face interaction for students, and we're all looking forward to the time when that will be able to take place again. But nevertheless, certainly, perhaps because this has been such an extended experience, we've all learned about the opportunities for remote learning, for remote engagement. So just on a personal level, you know, if I think back, students did do their exams in the summer term, and then usually if they were looking for feedback on their exam paper, some of them may have travelled back to the university in the summer if it was possible, or some of them waited until they came back to college in September. Whereas obviously now, with our familiarity with the ease of meeting online, sharing documents online, I can anticipate that indeed it would be much easier to be able to have contact with students out of term on a one-to-one basis than perhaps in the past, where we assumed that contact had to be kind of in person. So there's a lot of flexibility, and I think also one of the feedbacks from our learners is that some of our students, some students with certain disabilities have actually found it very helpful that all of the material has been recorded, that they've been able to you know, organize their learning at times that are convenient for them, perhaps adapting to their own personal conditions. So there are things that have, you know, enhanced the student experience. Of course, the thing that we're really missing is the personal social contact, but hopefully when that can resume, we won't lose some of those other facilities and opportunities that we've all learned about in this year.
Thank you very much. So this is probably my last question, and anyone can answer in the group. But Professor Maher, if you are still able to answer, that would be very interesting. So somebody wants to know, with the work from home becoming a norm, how different could this affect, or how differently could it affect men from women? And for women, would it be counterproductive? I think what the question is trying to find out is, granted that we work from home these days, is it possible to bury ahead impact men and women equally, given that women usually many jurisdictions or many countries have a greater burden for catering to their homes and families. So do you think this in the long run will affect women, especially women in academia, more negatively than their male counterpart? So anyone can answer about Professor Maher?
I'm pausing to reflect on that. Yes, you know, the issue is not so much they're working from home, but that it may highlight the extent to which they assume additional responsibilities within that working space. Within that, it's another form of working space, in my view, if you're at home, because if you're doing housework, that's still work. And it'll require additional discipline, and that can be a challenge. And that said, I'm a female academic on a personal note who likes to work from home if I can, and I do have children, but they learned never to come upstairs at certain times of the day. But the issue is that there are, it reflects a greater unevenness in society, or that women do tend to assume more responsibility in the home. That said, I do think the flexibility point shouldn't be forgotten either. And the issue is whether you have to work at home or whether you can work at home. And provided it is that you can work at home, maybe there are ways to work that to the advantage of anyone who experiences, because you might have, as I said earlier, there might be a problem around space, irrespective of care responsibilities and/or care responsibilities. So I think, again, it's can work from home as opposed to must work at home is the important factor.
Okay. All right. So although we have run out of time, I was wondering whether the esteemed panelists have final thoughts, perhaps 1 minute or less, as closing statement. Professor KHALIQ?
Yes, just a very quick follow-up to the point that's just been made. I think that distinction between can you work from home or must you work from home is a critical one, because studies have already shown that the amount of research produced by female academics where they have been compelled to work from home has meant that their ability to produce research has fallen significantly compared to male colleagues, which means it's always the unremunerated work at home which women are bearing the sort of uneven burden of. So that clearly has had a very clear and gendered dimension, has a very clear gender dimension as far as it affects female academic colleagues. You can see that very clearly. And I think that is something which is very important to bear in mind. More broadly on your point, I certainly think that the pandemic has led to significant cultural shifts in how we will work going forward. And one can see very clearly that a conference such as this remotely can work very well. If we consider the environmental footprint that we would have created by traveling to India to do this, you can consider the difference. And this has worked, if I may say, I think as well as a live panel would have. So I think those sorts of things will make a significant difference, and therefore we probably have to think going forward, what is the significant added value of face-to-face interaction that you cannot achieve remotely? Because even 10 years ago, the technology didn't exist to do this. The technology going forward will improve. So I think that those are questions that where the pandemic will have a legacy which is positive for education and make education actually more accessible, hopefully in time.
Thank you very much. Professor MASTRUZZO?
Yes, I think that we should also support active engagement irrespective of distancing and social distancing. I think it is extremely important in these times to relaunch clinical programs, legal clinical programs. I think it is extremely important that the students understand that being a law professional gives you a duty, an opportunity in life, but also a duty to make for change and to make for a better world.
Thank you very much. Professor Bell, final thoughts?
Yeah, just to be very brief, I think, one of the things that's going to be really important is that we collect data to really understand what the full impact of this experience was on our students and on our staff. We're still living it, it's still unfolding, and we're only beginning to really see what the impact has been. So I think one of the challenges for the next calendar year is to really, as academics, to gather the data and pay attention to the evidence.
Thank you very much. So we have run out of gas completely now, but I think we have also dealt seriously at the questions, and your thought-provoking remarks will certainly be helpful to university administrators in fashioning policies that will help, design effective, inclusive policies for students and those in university spaces that are usually marginalized. So thank you very much for your contributions and thought-provoking remarks.